Welcome, everybody. I'm Leslie O'Flahaven, and I'm so pleased to welcome you today to our LinkedIn Live broadcast with author Sara I. James. Welcome, Sara. How are you?
I'm great, Leslie. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I'm going to do the show and tell portion of our conversation first. Look,
Ooh,
look.
pretty.
Yes, indeed. Very pretty and such a wonderful accomplishment. So I'll congratulate you on the publication of Radical Reporting, and I'll look forward to asking you all about it. Let's see who's joining us today. If you are joining and you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself, we'd love to know who you are, where you're coming from, where you're joining us from, and perhaps if you have a question for Sara or a question about writing in plain language in general. I'm joining you today from the Washington, D.C. area. Sara, where are you coming from today?
I'm currently based in Oxford, in England.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we have Jaya here. Who else is coming in? Let's see. Well, we'll have our joiners uh, uh, greet us and let us know about their location as they arrive. So I'll introduce myself briefly, and then Sara, it will be your turn. My name is Leslie. My company is called eWrite, and our business is to help people learn to write well at work. I am a lifelong plain language advocate and a writing teacher. I'm a LinkedIn learning author of 6 different writing courses, and I hope you'll check them out. Sara, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is I am a huge fan of Leslie's, and I think
Thank
everything
you.
she has done really furthers the cause of plain language. And more importantly, it makes people's lives easier, easier to write, easier to read. So, who am I? I run a business called Getting Words to Work. And currently, I tend to travel the world when I'm lucky enough to travel, running mostly report writing training for teams across the globe. I do focus on report writing, training, and consultancy. My background is in academia, publishing, IT, and finance. And my USP, I would say, compared to other writing tutors, certainly in my sphere, is my focus on language, history of the language, and indeed languages.
Wow, wonderful. And so pleased to meet you and all the people who are joining us today. What a great group we've gathered from all around the world. So, I'll begin with my first question, and I hope it's not the hardest one I have to answer. My first
Ooh.
question for you, Ms. Sara, my author, is why did you entitle the book Radical Reporting?
Well, I have to give credit to somebody on one of my courses a couple of years ago who said, and she wasn't the only person to say this, wow, what you're teaching us is completely radical. It overturns everything I've ever believed or thought I knew about how to write, especially in the workplace. So I'd say it's radical in the sense of overturning myths, and very often harmful myths that don't help us and don't help the readers. It also goes to the root of the word radical, which literally means the root. And what I try to do in the book is take us back to the basics and say, what is the root of communication? What is the root of effective communication? Why do we communicate with each other and how do we communicate with each other? So that's why I called it radical reporting.
Would you like to topple one of those myths right now for us? Would you just like to knock it down?
Absolutely. Yes. I would say one thing that really plagues corporate writing and the poor people who produce it and have to read it is the belief that in the workplace or in academia, you have to use long words and long sentences because that looks really fancy. And I always say if you're thinking about how you're coming across to the reader, you're thinking of yourself and not the reader. But also, it just doesn't work. If you put yourself in the reader's shoes, long, wordy, convoluted, frankly, pretentious writing turns us all off and it just fails at the first hurdle.
Yes, and I will say a giant no thank you to a platter of long, wordy, convoluted writing. No thank you at all. Wonderful. Now, for all of our joiners, if you have a question for me or for Sara, our author today, just go ahead and put it in the chat. We'd be glad to answer the question. With that, I'm going to ask you our second question. What do you think stops people from writing in plain language?
A couple of things. So certainly what I referred to already, that habit or the conditioning. So people are conditioned either, in their university education or when they get to work to write a certain way. And they think this is how people do things. This must be good. So conditioning is very hard to overcome. Um, it's habit. But two other things. I'm maybe a bit controversial here, but I don't think so. Um, I tackle them in my book. I say habit, tiredness, and fear are the
Mhm,
enemies of clear communication. So, habit, I've just mentioned, but also tiredness. Everyone's tired, everyone's busy, everyone is freaking out about deadlines. And when you write in a rush, you won't write well.
mm,
Especially if you're tired and you're reaching for the shortcuts and the buzzwords rather than thinking things through rigorously.
mhm,
Fear, I think, is very important. There's fear of maybe not coming across as sophisticated or educated. That leads to overwriting. People are also afraid if they have to convey something in a report that is unwelcome news. And all of a sudden, they start wrapping up the message in verbiage like cotton wool. And I think these three things, habit, tiredness, and fear, that all human beings confront almost daily, are at the root of not writing in plain language, in my view. I don't know what your view is, Leslie.
Well, actually, I'm actually kind of moved. I am moved because habit, tiredness, and fear are things people can change. And as my career as a lifelong writing teacher and your career as a writing teacher, we personally believe that people can develop better writing skills. I believe this in my core, or I wouldn't do my job.
Yeah.
And I'm really moved by the way you described habit, tiredness, and fear. We can change our habits. My goodness, people quit smoking,
Yeah.
with a nicotine addiction. They change their habit. Tiredness, while sadly a condition of today's workplace, can be altered. And I think what you said about fear is so interesting because I have seen that as people rise on the corporate ladder, as they gain more authority, and therefore as they have less fear of reprimand from the
Yes.
person above them, they often do prefer plain communication. I'm not saying they can write that way, but they ask their subordinates to write that way as they lose their professional fear. So I'm serious, Sarah. This is moving to me, and I will think about this trio: habit, tiredness, and fear for a long time. Thank you. That's really eye-opening. Now we have some hellos. We have Michael coming in from Fargo, North Dakota. Hi, Michael. We have Abdul greeting us, and then we have a question from Taylor. Human
Wow.
resource interview questions might need to be prepared. Let's come back to that because, Taylor, I think it would help if you would elaborate a little. I'm not
Mm.
sure I understand exactly your connection between human resource interview questions. So if you could elaborate a little, that would be great. Here's Estella. I'm transitioning from law to UX writing, and it has been challenging in terms of plain language. Yes, indeed, UX writing is, sometimes the best two syllables you could ever write. So I can understand that. And here's Khrushchev commenting, I'm Haitian living in Argentina and learning a lot. My
Can
goodness, Khrushchev, you must be a multilingual person. Sarah, go ahead.
can I just jump in?
Mm-hmm.
So, Estella, just a quick resource for you. Someone I highly recommend. Um, Brian Garner
Mm-hmm.
um, is a plain language advocate. He's a Texan lawyer, and he is a worldwide expert on English grammar and usage. And he's got a great book called Legal Writing in Plain Language. And I'm just wondering if that could help you bridge the gap from some of the habits you've acquired in legal writing to UX writing. If
Mm-hmm.
Garner would be a really good person to sort of step you through from
Yes.
one tradition or one approach to the other one.
Yes. Well, that's a great reminder that Estella will be called upon to have uh, professional flexibility. She's going to be bending and twisting a little as she changes her careers. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Well, another invitation, everyone who's joining us, please include your questions and your comments. We're really happy to hear from you. And now I would like to ask you a question about your journey as an author. Sara,
Wow.
what did the process of writing radical reporting teach you about writing?
I'm going to probably annoy everyone by saying nothing.
What?
What do I mean by that? I have been writing professionally as a freelance writer and also as a translator in 2 different languages for over 30 years. So, in terms of learning how to write, knowing how to write, and being able to do so quickly, efficiently, effectively, I've been practicing my craft for many years. I'd say it reinforced a few things and refreshed my understanding. So, the first thing that I want to share is the importance of planning.
Mm,
Because I teach everyone on my courses plan before you put pen to paper. Really work through what you think you have to say and all the different angles before you start writing. And I'll share with you that before I started writing, once the contract with the publisher was signed, I produced a 10-page detailed outline about the book content, and I sent it to the series editor, the commissioning editor, and also I had 2 subject matter expert reviewers. So I had John Cheshire, who's an expert in internal audit, risk, compliance, and IT security, and also Martin Cutts, author of the Oxford Guide to Plain English and a good friend. I sent that to all of them simply because if anyone disagreed about the order, the content, where things belonged, the proportionality, it's much easier to correct course when you have an outline in front of you than when you have submitted a third of the manuscript.
mhm.
So I would say there was that. The other thing, and I'm going to quote Joyce Carol Oates, who has in turn, I think, quoted other people, it simply reinforced the fact that writing is a job.
Mm,
And a lot of people say, I wait for inspiration.
mhm.
And Joyce Carol Oates said, people who talk about inspiration are amateurs. The rest of us just get up and go to work in the morning. So if you're writing and you're finding it a bit difficult, a bit boring, you're probably doing it right.
And that goes back to your theme and our theme today, that writing can be learned. So if it's inspiration, which it isn't, if it's inspiration, then you have to wait for something divine or accidental to befall you. If it's a skill that can be learned, then it can be learned. And as they say, proof of concept, you proved that your training, your teaching, your perspective, and the value of planning really worked in your own book. We have an interesting question from Simon. If someone comes to you and wants to develop their plain language writing skills, how much time do you say it takes on average to write well in plain language? And I have an answer too. You go first.
Oh, yes. Well, I suppose my answer, which Simon, you may not feel is very helpful, is it depends. Now, I would say, first of all, if somebody is approaching me or Leslie or any other plain language practitioner wanting to improve their plain language skills, they're more than 50% of the way there because they realize the importance of plain language. They realize that they can improve and they're willing to put the work in. Is it 50%?
Yes.
Leslie, you might tell me it's 90%. Um,
Yeah.
the remainder really does depend on their starting point, their particular habits, their particular fears. I would say the context they're working in. So, to what extent are they going to need support to become an advocate for plain language in
Mhm.
their organization? Or is it already a plain language organization and they are wanting to raise the bar in their own work?
Mhm.
So I would it really does depend. I've seen some people pick it up within a couple of weeks. I've seen other people say it's 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. I'm still struggling. I'm falling back into bad habits. But most of us would say it's been years and I'm still working on it.
That's a great
Leslie,
answer.
over to
Yes,
you.
I think writing in plain language is a lot like choosing to eat healthier foods. And just like choosing to eat healthier foods, you sometimes, backslide.
Yeah.
Some days you just need to eat potato chips and pizza, or make a potato chip sandwich out of two pieces of pizza. Sometimes you're just going to struggle to retain your commitment to writing in plain language. But I do know several proven ways to make this time from intent to product shorter. And one is to identify and store models of plain language writing you can rely on at any
Yeah.
time. Just like a chef uses recipes, people who intend to write in plain language need to have reference exemplars. They need to have, let me just look at a press release written in plain language, or let me just look at a tip sheet for a
Yeah.
health fair, how 10 tips on how to quit smoking. I want to see one written in plain language. So a person who's preparing themselves to write in plain language has a plan for acquiring these and storing them. You have to have a way to store them so that you can find them easily when you're ready. And Sarah, I really respond to your comment that an individual's efforts to write in plain language are either supported or strangled by
Yeah.
the people, their colleagues, and their communications team at their company. So if you have to champion plain language and write documents in plain language, it may take a lot longer to get something published. If you merely have to adopt plain language writing practices, but
Yeah.
you don't have to champion the cause of plain language, then you may go more quickly from intent to product. And finally, I would say your process, the time from intent to product in writing in plain language will be shorter if you have intimate connections with your readers, if you actually
Yes.
know your readers and can speak with them, because then you know what they want and you're providing it, and you can also champion the cause a little bit more easily.
Oh, those are
Now,
great points. Oh, some great questions as well that
yes,
tie in
indeed.
exactly to what you were saying.
Here we go. Here's Stephanie asking, hi, Stephanie. Look
Yeah.
at Stephanie's profile holding this little girl with pigtails.
Oh,
Do
how
you have any
fantastic.
recommendations to help with coaching others to use plain language, but still making sure it's formal or professional? Sometimes they take it too far and lose professionalism. Sarah, what do you think?
I have very strong views about this. Yes, it's it's something people worry about a lot, Stephanie, and I think you're right to be mindful of having a good balance. What I found working with a lot of people in the UK is they do assume that verbose, or I would even say pompous language, is professional. And my view is it's not, because it takes people longer to read. There's less chance they'll understand it. There's nothing professional about that. What I tend to do is move people towards plain language. And if they're a bit resistant and they say, well, that's not very professional, what I like to do is find good plain language examples in their sector and ask them how the people who've produced that are doing in terms of the company. And I work a lot with financial services, and a lot of people say, well, we have to write in a really complicated way because our financial instruments are so complex, etc. And I direct them towards the letters to shareholders from Warren Buffett of Berkshire
Mm-hmm.
Hathaway. And anyone who thinks that Warren Buffett or Berkshire Hathaway is unprofessional or unsuccessful hasn't been paying attention. And it's a perfect example of how you can use plain language. And he does have a rather folksy tone of voice, which I don't think everyone suits. Which I don't think suits everyone. But he definitely uses plain language.
Mm-hmm.
And, Rupert Morris, who's a wonderful plain language coach, he's retired now in the UK, he did what he called the Clarity Index. And he and his colleagues looked at the annual reports from the FTSE 100, so the equivalent of the New York Stock Exchange in the UK. They looked at those 100 companies' annual reports and they rated them on plain language. And the companies that wrote in plain language consistently outperformed everyone else.
Mhm.
So I think, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. People get nervous because it's what they're not used to. But if you can show them some evidence that directly links plain language to better business performance, then I think it redefines what professional writing is.
I'm with you 100%. And the idea that we are seeing that you've cited the financial performance of companies that write in plain language. This is highly motivating, isn't it? I think Stephanie's asking a slightly different question. She says,
Oh,
in fact, sometimes people who are striving to write in plain language do lose professionalism. And I have seen this too. You take someone
really?
who, yes, you take someone
Okay.
who is writing in a very stilted way, and then it sounds like Stephanie has coached these writers. You needn't write in that stilted, a dry, academic, overly formal tone, and then they go too
Too
far.
far.
Right. And I would say, Stephanie, we need to protect writers from any negative costs, any harms they might incur by going too far and writing gotcha instead of GOTCHA, that kind of thing. That is too far.
Yeah.
What you're actually seeing, Stephanie, is someone applying a new skill and applying it ineptly because it's a new skill. So, because Stephanie's comment mentions coaching, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
Stephanie, you do coach. And I would just say, just like any new skill, sometimes people who were over here swing all the way over here,
I
they
see.
swing too far, and then you coach them back just a little bit. It's
What
part of
I've
the
seen
learning.
what I've seen is people cut too much out, so they're too detailed, and then they get rid of all the detail and the writing becomes a bit cryptic. And I say,
Mm,
okay, if you keep the sentences short, it's easier
mhm.
to read, and then you can see where you need to add more detail.
Right, right, right.
Not by cramming a lot more into the same sentence, but build up the
Yes.
understanding with lots of shorter sentences.
Right. And Sarah, that's exactly what I think Stephanie's talking about, though I think she
Okay.
was talking about unprofessional writing. The example you gave is this, here's the coach, a plain language
Yeah.
coach saying, please, you have way too much detail. And then they
Too
end
much.
up with too
I
little.
have to say, I haven't seen anyone go too far and become grossly unprofessional.
Yes.
I look forward to seeing that. I think that would be quite amusing.
But actually, I have seen it in the customer service
Oh, yeah.
writers I've coached to write in a more natural and more candid style. Sometimes they just go too
They go
far.
too far.
Yes,
Okay, got
indeed. Now
it.
we have a
Okay.
couple of other
Wow.
questions, and Sarah, we should watch our time here. We're doing great. Maria has asked, are there any suggestions to educate clients who have zero approach to plain language in a polite, straightforward way? What advice would you have for Maria?
Absolutely. A lot of the people I work with say, I believe in plain language, but my boss, who's who
Hmm.
has to sign off on my draft report, really likes to fancy it up. And I say, what
Hmm.
I would do then is if they rewrite something and say, okay, sorry, sorry, it's been a long day. Can you just read that out loud to me?
Mm-hmm.
And they usually see immediately what the problem is with the sentence. So, what I
Hmm.
would do is ask them to talk you through their preferred approach. And 9 times out of 10, they will come to the conclusion that they've gone too far.
Hmm.
Because that way it doesn't become a conflict and it's not you imposing it, it's you asking them to share their views.
Yes. And your answer reminds everybody who's joining us about the reliability, the honesty of the spoken version of what you wrote.
Read it out loud.
Read it out loud. Yes. Jennifer has asked, in regard to verbose language for the purpose of artistic expression, is this not relevant anymore? I'm going to answer quickly. I want my husband to be verbose when he writes me a love letter on Valentine's Day. I am not here for short, candid novels. If it's artistic, it's a different category of
Yeah, I would say
expression.
so. And I would say your question, Jennifer, is an interesting one because you're saying, is it not relevant anymore? Makes it sound as though it was relevant previously. And I think verbose is generally not a good thing, but
Hmm.
you could have more embellished
Hmm.
or more more figurative language. And
Mhm.
that really depends on the author. So if you compare, I would say, the ultimate plain language author, Ernest Hemingway,
Right.
with, oh, I'm trying to think of a US author who goes to the other extreme,
William
probably
Faulkner. William
Faulkner. I
Faulkner.
was going to say
Mhm.
Faulkner.
Mhm.
Both great writers, both made their stylistic choices, and I think we can learn from all of them.
Indeed. And the arts are kind of outside of this
Yeah.
particular set of criteria here. Here's a question from Clementina. What other books written in plain language would you recommend we read or check out in order to familiarize ourselves? I'm going to suggest one. Sarah, could you suggest one? And then Sarah and I will add to the comments in the recording of this conversation any other books we think about. So I'll make my suggestion very quickly. I recommend the book Letting Go of the Words, written by Ginny Redish, Redish, Letting Go of the Words. And it's a book about writing web content. It doesn't promote itself, Ginny isn't promoting it primarily as a plain language book, but it's a wonderful book. Ginny is a wonderful author, and I recommend that one. How about you, Sarah?
Well, thank you, first of all, because I didn't know that book at all. So that's going immediately on my reading list. I would go back to the book I cited earlier, The Oxford Guide to Plain English,
Wonderful.
by Martin Cutts. And it's a wonderful, affordable paperback. And it's just such an accessible, unpretentious, dip in kind of book. And it's got an entire chapter, chapter 17, called about myths. And
Okay.
so, any myths that you are struggling against, you can go to the Oxford Guide and get some ammunition.
Wonderful. Locked and loaded. Okay, so here we go. Our last question for today is, what advice do you have for people who write the types of reports you mentioned in your book? Here we go. That is audit, risk, compliance, and information security reports. So you can give us our piece of advice. And then after that, we're going to say goodbye for today and continue our conversation in the comments in our video. And please share the video widely if you'd like. Miss Sarah, go right
Yes,
ahead.
I will do, Miss Leslie. So, it would actually be the same advice I would give to anyone, which
Mm,
is to become alert to the difference between the active voice and the passive voice.
hmm.
So, the difference between doer, action, done to, active voice, and done to, action. Maybe or maybe not, we find out who the doer is, passive voice. If you write in the active voice, most of the time your writing is clearer, crisper, more compelling. And if you're writing reports that are the results of lengthy, usually forensic kinds of investigations, you really need to know who did or didn't do what when,
Right, right.
um, in order to, have a strong case. And if you
Hmm.
can't phrase things in the active voice, maybe you need to go back and check your own research and check your own investigative work. The minute you start relying on the passive voice, mistakes were made, lessons were learned, steps will be taken, an investigation has been launched. It just all gets way too woolly and fluffy and pretty much useless.
Your answer is so meaningful because you are matching a sentence syntax choice, namely to write in active voice, with the overall purpose of your report, which
Yeah.
is to explain who did what and at what consequence. So, for anyone who would dismiss grammar as unimportant or passive voice and active voice as a choice that doesn't matter very much, in these types of reports, it matters a great deal. We don't have to be kind of passive voice scapegoaters when someone writes, the mail was delivered. We know the letter carrier
It's
delivered the
fine.
mail, right? But when you're writing a report of this type, who did what, for at what consequence?
And
Yes.
Rupert Morris, who came up with the Clarity Index,
Hmm.
his rule of thumb is no more than 20%. And I've just seen Meredith's, and I have to say, plainlanguage.gov website is one of my favorite.
Indeed.
Um, and
Indeed.
it's actually got some really funny stuff there, especially for people in the technical sphere. Somebody was asking about engineering earlier. Go to the plainlanguage.gov website, and you will find things that inform and entertain.
Indeed, indeed. Well, this is going to be goodbye for now, Sarah, but I think everyone who has joined us could tell that you and I could talk for many hours on this topic. And I'm just so happy for you and so proud of you
Thank you.
in the most collegial way. This is a wonderful book. I've read it. You can see that I really like the section on culture. That's where my bookmark stayed. Thank you so much for joining me, and to everyone else who joined, thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Leslie.